Welcome back to Real Life Documentary, a channel that's dedicated to telling you real-life tragic stories. Please support us by subscribing to our channel and liking our videos. Now to today's episode. Marcus had always admired Tyler's mom, Carol. She was tall, strikingly beautiful, with long dark hair that smelled of lavender. Her smile had a way of making Marcus's heart race. In the beginning, it was nothing more than a harmless crush. After all, Carol was Tyler's mother and had always treated Marcus like one of her own. But as Marcus got older, his feelings for her began to change. He started to notice the little things, how she moved around the kitchen, her hips gently swaying as she cooked, her soft humming filling the house with a comforting warmth. The smell of fresh bread and herbs lingered in the air, making the home feel inviting, and Marcus found himself drawn to her more and more. One day when Marcus was 18, something inside him shifted. He was at Tyler's house as he often was, but this time Tyler wasn't home. Sitting at the kitchen table, Marcus watched Carol as she stood by the stove, stirring a pot, completely focused. Without thinking, Marcus got up and walked over to her, brushing his hand against her lower back as he pretended to reach for a glass on the counter, his feelings bubbling to the surface after months of silent longing. Carol froze, her body tensing at Marcus's touch. "Marcus," she said quietly, turning her head slightly, "you shouldn't be doing that." Her voice was calm, but Marcus noticed the tension in her shoulders. She was nervous. That didn't stop him, though. He smiled, pretending it was no big deal, like it had been an accident, but it wasn't. In the days that followed, Marcus pushed the boundaries further. Carol would be chopping vegetables, her attention elsewhere, and he would place his hand on her waist, letting his fingers linger a little too long. Each time she would flinch and pull away, her voice becoming more firm. "Marcus, stop. This isn't appropriate. I'm serious, don't. You need to stop." But Marcus didn't stop. With every touch, her protests became softer, and the tension between them grew undeniable. It was no longer just about a touch or a glance. Something unspoken hung between them, a dangerous attraction neither could ignore. One evening, as Carol stood by the stove, Marcus couldn't hold back any longer. He approached her from behind, gently wrapping his hand around her neck, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. She jumped, her knife clattering against the counter as she turned to face him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Marcus, what are you doing?" Her voice trembled, shaken by his actions. He moved closer, the warmth from the stove radiating against his skin. "I can't help it, Carol. You drive me crazy." Carol stepped back, her back pressing against the counter, trapping her between Marcus and the sink. She shook her head, trying to keep control. "You're my son's best friend. This is wrong. You have to stop." But Marcus didn't stop. Instead, he pushed further, his hand gripping her waist more firmly this time, feeling the curve of her body through her clothes. Carol gasped, her breath quickening, but she didn't push him away. In the weeks that followed, these moments became more frequent. Marcus found any excuse to touch her, while she was washing dishes, bending to retrieve something from the oven, or standing by the refrigerator. Each time Carol told him to stop, her voice tinged with fear and panic, but with every passing day, her resistance seemed to grow weaker. One afternoon, as Carol prepared dinner, Marcus entered the kitchen silently, watching her from the doorway. She didn't notice him until he was right behind her, his hands sliding around her waist again. This time she didn't jump. She froze but didn't pull away. The tension between them was thick, almost unbearable. "Marcus," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible over the sizzling pan. "Please stop this." But when she turned to face him, her hands didn't push him away. Instead, they rested on his chest, hesitating, uncertain. Her breaths were shallow, and Marcus could see the internal battle she was fighting. She knew it was wrong, but something inside her had already given up. Whether it was the attention or the thrill of doing something forbidden, Carol stopped resisting. Their first kiss happened right there in the kitchen. Marcus leaned down, brushing his lips softly against hers, testing the waters. She didn't move. His heart raced as he kissed her more deeply, his hands gripping her waist. Slowly, Carol kissed him back, and in that moment everything changed. Their affair spiraled out of control from there. What began as stolen touches escalating into secret kisses, passionate embraces when no one was looking, and stolen moments behind closed doors. The kitchen became their sanctuary, a place where they could be alone, away from prying eyes. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with just kisses. He wanted more, and so did Carol, even though she hated herself for it. She couldn't look at Tyler the same way anymore. The guilt was eating away at her. But she couldn't stop. Marcus's hands were always on her, while she cooked, while she cleaned, while she sat on the couch watching TV. It became their routine, their secret, their sin. Carol's protests faded, and soon she wasn't telling him to stop anymore. Marcus had won, and their affair became the darkest secret they shared. Their affair was a ticking time bomb. The more they indulged in their passion, the more reckless they became. They couldn't resist the magnetic pull between them, even when it seemed dangerous. Every moment with Tyler nearby was a risk, but that only made their encounters more thrilling. It wasn't just the danger of being caught. It felt as though they were spiraling toward something uncontrollable. One evening, Tyler invited Marcus over to work on a school project. They had been best friends since childhood, and Tyler trusted Marcus like a brother. As they sat at the dining room table, papers and notebooks scattered in front of them, Carol moved around the kitchen preparing dinner. Marcus's eyes, however, weren't on the homework. They were on Carol. She stood at the counter, chopping vegetables with deliberate movements, her face focused. But each time she looked up, her eyes locked with Marcus's, a silent understanding passing between them. Tyler, oblivious, muttered to himself about the upcoming test, scribbling in his notebook. Carol, feeling Marcus's gaze on her, trembled, the weight of their secret growing heavier with each passing moment. Carol had been trying to avoid Marcus, fully aware that they were treading on dangerous ground. But the temptation was always there, simmering beneath the surface. She could feel his presence in the house like a shadow, a constant reminder of the forbidden desire that had taken hold of her life. When Tyler stepped out to grab something from his room, Marcus seized the opportunity. He stood up slowly, walking quietly but deliberately toward the kitchen. Carol turned, her breath catching as he approached. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But before she could finish or push him away, Marcus leaned in and kissed her, his lips pressing against hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. The knife she had been holding slipped from her hands as she melted into the kiss. It was dangerous, reckless even, but at that moment neither of them cared. Suddenly, Tyler's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Carol pulled back quickly, her heart racing. "Stop, he's coming," she whispered frantically, pushing Marcus away. But Marcus just smiled, a cocky grin on his face as he backed off, his eyes still locked on hers. Tyler walked back in, completely unaware of the tension that had gripped the room. "Hey, Mom. Do you think you could help us with this math problem? You know I'm terrible at it," Tyler said casually. Carol, still flushed from the kiss, nodded quickly, trying to compose herself. "Of course, honey, let me take a look." She moved to sit beside him, but her thoughts weren't on the math problem. They were on Marcus, who sat across from her, his eyes filled with desire. The following days blurred into a series of increasingly dangerous encounters. The tension between Marcus and Carol had reached its breaking point, and each stolen touch and whispered word only fueled the fire they were playing with. One afternoon, while Tyler was in the shower, Marcus cornered Carol in the hallway. The sound of running water provided just enough cover for them to give in to their growing lust. Marcus pressed Carol against the wall, his hands roaming her body as he kissed her with fierce intensity. Carol's weak protests soon gave way, and she found herself kissing him back with the same desperation that consumed them both. "We need to stop this," she whispered breathlessly as he pulled away, her hands clutching his shirt. "It's too dangerous." Marcus's eyes darkened. "Do you really want to stop?" Carol hesitated. The truth was she didn't. Despite knowing they were headed toward destruction, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Their secret affair had become an addiction, one she couldn't quit, even if it meant risking everything. One evening, the affair reached its most dangerous point yet. Tyler had invited some friends over for a small party, and the house was full of noise and laughter as the boys crowded into the living room, eating pizza and watching sports. Carol, as usual, stayed in the kitchen pretending to be busy, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on Marcus, who had slipped away from the group and was now standing beside her. "Marcus, not now," she hissed, glancing nervously toward the living room where Tyler and his friends were distracted. Marcus ignored her, stepping closer, his body brushing against hers. "They won't notice," he murmured, leaning in until his lips were inches from her ear. "You know you want this." Carol's breath hitched, her pulse racing. She knew how insane it was. Tyler was just a few feet away. But the danger of being caught made it impossible to resist. She let out a soft sigh, her body betraying her as Marcus's hand slid around her waist. "Marcus, we can't," she whispered, her voice shaky, but her protest was weak, and he knew it. Their lips met in a hurried, desperate kiss, Carol's hands tangling in his hair as they pulled each other closer. The sound of the television and the boys' laughter drifted through the house, but they were lost in each other. Suddenly, Tyler's voice called from the living room. "Hey Marcus, you coming back or what?" Marcus quickly pulled away, his breath ragged, and Carol stumbled back, her face flushed. She turned to the counter, pretending to busy herself with the dishes, while Marcus flashed her a cocky grin before heading back to the living room. But that close call only intensified the affair. Over the next few weeks, Marcus and Carol grew bolder. They kissed behind closed doors, stole touches when no one was looking, and even began sneaking away to Marcus's car late at night while Tyler slept. The danger, the thrill of being caught, consumed them, and they were willing to risk everything for just one more moment together. But their luck wouldn't last forever. One day, Tyler came home early from work, tired and irritated after a long shift. As he entered the house, he heard whispers coming from the kitchen, followed by the sound of something clattering to the floor. Curious, he walked quietly toward the noise, his footsteps soft as he approached the kitchen door. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, in the dim light of the kitchen, stood Marcus and Carol, their bodies pressed against each other in a passionate kiss. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the betrayal crashed over him. Tyler's best friend, the person he trusted the most, and his mother, the woman he thought he knew, had both been deceiving him. Without making a sound, Tyler turned and left the house, the image of Marcus and his mother locked in that kiss seared into his mind. But as he walked away, something dark began to take shape. A plan that would change everything. Tyler had always been patient, but after witnessing that betrayal, something inside him snapped. For days he said nothing. His heart was heavy with anger, confusion, and a growing thirst for revenge. Every time he looked at Marcus, all he could see was the man who had stolen his mother, who had crossed an unforgivable line. And every time he looked at Carol, his own mother, he felt nothing but disgust and sadness. How could she do this to him? How could she betray their family? The rage built inside him, but Tyler hid it well, biding his time until the moment was right. Meanwhile, Marcus and Carol continued their affair, oblivious to the fact that Tyler knew everything. They grew careless, meeting late at night in the kitchen, sneaking kisses in dark corners of the house, confident that they were still keeping their secret. But Tyler was watching, waiting and planning. One night, Tyler decided it was time to act. He had spent hours replaying the betrayal in his mind, imagining all the ways he could get revenge. But this was no longer a fantasy. It was about to become reality. When Marcus came over to hang out, it seemed like any other evening. The two friends sat in the living room playing video games, but the tension in the air was palpable, though Marcus didn't notice. Carol was in the kitchen, cooking dinner and humming softly as she moved between the stove and the counter. Tyler's eyes flicked toward the kitchen every so often, knowing exactly what would happen next. By now it was a routine. Whenever Tyler was distracted, Marcus would sneak off to find his mother. And tonight Tyler was counting on it. As expected, Marcus waited until Tyler seemed fully engrossed in the game before quietly slipping out of the room. Tyler, watching from the corner of his eye, saw him make his way toward the kitchen. The anger that had been building inside him flared, but he forced himself to remain calm. It wasn't time to act yet. In the kitchen, Carol was chopping vegetables when Marcus entered. She glanced up at him, her eyes darting toward the living room to make sure Tyler wasn't paying attention. "Not now, Marcus," she whispered, her voice tight with tension. "He's right there." But Marcus smiled, stepping closer until he was standing behind her. "He's not going to notice," he murmured, his hand sliding around her waist. "We've been careful this long." Carol sighed, torn between guilt and the powerful, irresistible pull of their affair. She turned to face him, already surrendering to the inevitable. As their lips met in a kiss, a sound broke the moment. Just a soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under someone's weight. They both froze, eyes darting toward the kitchen door, but saw no one. Marcus chuckled softly, his hand still on her waist. "Relax," he whispered. "We're fine." But Carol couldn't shake the unease. The atmosphere felt different tonight. Heavier. As if something was brewing beneath the surface. And she was right. Tyler had seen everything. He had followed Marcus silently to the kitchen, watching the betrayal unfold yet again. His heart pounded in his chest, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. But he didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, he returned to the living room, his mind racing. The plan he had been formulating was coming together perfectly. He just needed to wait a little longer. Later that evening, after Marcus left, Tyler decided it was time to confront his mother. He walked into the kitchen where Carol was cleaning up, her back turned to him, lost in her own thoughts of guilt and shame. She didn't hear him come in. When she finally turned around, Tyler was standing there, his expression unreadable. "Mom," he said, his voice calm but filled with tension. "We need to talk." Carol's heart skipped a beat. She had dreaded this moment, knowing deep down that Tyler would eventually find out. But she hadn't expected it to happen like this. "Tyler, she began, but he cut her off. "How long has this been going on?" he asked coldly. "How long have you been sleeping with Marcus?" Carol's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was too heavy, too shameful to admit. Tyler stared at his mother, his eyes blazing with anger and betrayal. "I trusted you," he said, his voice shaking. "You're my mother, and you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The pain was too much. Carol took a step toward him, her hands reaching out as if she could somehow fix the damage she'd caused. "Tyler, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake. A mistake." Tyler's voice rose, the anger he had been holding back now boiling over. "This wasn't a mistake, Mom. This was a choice. You chose him over me. You chose to lie to me, to betray me." Carol tried to speak again, but Tyler wasn't listening anymore. The rage that had been simmering inside him for weeks finally erupted. He turned and stormed out of the kitchen, his heart racing, needing to get away before he did something he couldn't take back. But even as he left, the anger only grew stronger. The next day, Tyler woke up with a single dark thought. Marcus had to pay. It wasn't enough to confront his mother. The real betrayal had come from Marcus, his best friend, the person he had trusted more than anyone. And now that trust was shattered. Tyler spent the entire day plotting his revenge, his mind twisted with thoughts of retribution. He knew Marcus would come over that evening. It was their routine. And this time Tyler would be ready. When Marcus arrived that night, everything seemed normal. Tyler greeted him as usual, his anger masked by indifference. Marcus, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside his friend, went about his usual routine, hanging out in the living room, waiting for the right moment to sneak off to the kitchen. But Tyler was watching him closely, his mind racing with dark thoughts. At some point, Marcus excused himself, saying he needed to use the bathroom. But Tyler knew better. He followed Marcus silently, his footsteps quiet and deliberate. As he watched Marcus slip into the kitchen, where Carol was once again preparing dinner, Tyler's blood boiled. It was the same scene, the same betrayal playing out all over again. Tyler felt the weight of the knife he had taken from the kitchen drawer earlier, hidden under his shirt. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the handle, the cold steel pressing against his skin. The moment had come. He waited until Marcus and Carol were once again locked in a forbidden embrace, completely unaware of his presence. Then, with a swift, silent movement, Tyler stepped into the kitchen, his eyes dark with rage. "Marcus," Tyler said, his voice low but deadly. Marcus froze, pulling away from Carol in shock. He turned to see Tyler standing in the doorway, the knife gleaming in his hand. For a moment no one moved. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the pounding of Tyler's heart. "What the hell, Tyler?" Marcus stammered, stepping back. "What are you doing?" Tyler didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Marcus, his grip tightening around the knife. Marcus's grip tightened on the knife. Everything Tyler had felt over the past few weeks, the anger, the betrayal, the pain, surged to the surface. He couldn't hold it back anymore. In a sudden violent motion, Tyler lunged at Marcus, the knife slicing through the air. Marcus, caught off guard, tried to dodge, but it was too late. The blade sank into his side, and Marcus let out a cry of pain, stumbling back against the counter. "Tyler, stop!" Carol screamed, rushing toward her son, but Tyler was beyond reason. He pulled the knife out and stabbed Marcus again, his rage fueling every thrust. Blood splattered across the kitchen floor, the room echoing with the sound of Marcus's gasps and Carol's desperate screams. Tyler didn't stop until Marcus collapsed to the ground, lifeless in a pool of blood. The knife slipped from Tyler's hand, clattering to the floor as he stood over his best friend's body, breathing heavily, his hands shaking. Carol fell to her knees beside Marcus, her sobs filling the air as she cradled his bloodied body. "What have you done?" she cried, her voice trembling with a mix of horror and disbelief. Tyler stood over her, his chest still heaving, his heart pounding in his ears. The reality of what he had done began sinking in, but it felt distant, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He stared at his mother, her hands soaked in Marcus's blood, and his stomach twisted. "I didn't mean..." Tyler's voice was weak, barely audible. He deserved it." Carol looked up at her son, her face streaked with tears, her expression one of utter devastation. "He was your best friend, Tyler," she screamed. "You killed him. You killed him." Tyler took a step back, the weight of her words crushing him. He had acted in blind rage, fueled by betrayal and jealousy. But now all that was left was the cold, hard reality of what he had done. There was no going back, no undoing the brutal murder of the person who had once been his closest friend. "I had to," Tyler whispered, more to himself than to her. "I had to do it." But deep down he knew that wasn't true. He didn't have to kill Marcus. He could have confronted him, could have walked away. But instead he had let his anger take control. And now he was standing in the ruins of his own life. Carol's sobs quieted as she rocked back and forth beside Marcus's lifeless body, the enormity of what had just happened crashing down on both of them. The room was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the distant sound of sirens. The neighbors must have heard the commotion, and soon the police would arrive. Panic began to set in as Tyler glanced around the kitchen, his mind racing. What was he going to do? Run? Turn himself in? His hands shook uncontrollably as he looked down at the blood staining his clothes and the lifeless face of his best friend. "Mom," Tyler started, but Carol didn't respond. She couldn't even look at him now. Her grief consumed her, and Tyler knew he had lost her too. Everything was gone, his best friend, his mother, his future. The sirens grew louder, and Tyler realized there was no escaping this. He stood frozen as the front door burst open and the police stormed in. Officers shouted at him to get on the ground, and in a daze Tyler obeyed, dropping to his knees with his hands behind his head. He barely registered the handcuffs being snapped onto his wrists or the officers pulling him to his feet. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment over and over, wondering how it had all gone so horribly wrong. As Tyler was led out of the house, his mother's cries echoed behind him. Neighbors had gathered outside, staring in shock as he was pushed into the back of the police car. The flashing lights reflected off the wet pavement, casting an ominous glow on the scene of the crime. Tyler's trial was swift. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The blood on his clothes, the knife with his fingerprints, and the testimony from his mother. There was no question of his guilt, only of his punishment. Throughout the trial, Tyler remained silent, barely speaking except to answer the judge's questions. His defense attorney attempted to argue temporary insanity, citing the emotional trauma of the betrayal and the impulsive nature of the crime, but it wasn't enough. The jury wasn't swayed, the facts were clear. Tyler had murdered his best friend in cold blood. The courtroom was packed on the day of sentencing. Reporters filled the gallery, eager for the final verdict in the case that had shocked the community. Tyler sat at the defense table, his face pale and hollow as the judge read the sentence. "Tyler Barnes, for the crime of murder in the first degree, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words echoed in Tyler's mind, but he felt numb. Life in prison, no parole. His entire future gone in a flash of anger. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, paying for a moment of rage that had destroyed everything. Carol sat in the courtroom, her eyes red from days of crying, Her body slumped in defeat. She had lost her son, her lover, and her entire world. There was no solace for her. No way to undo the damage that had been done. As Tyler was led away in handcuffs, he cast one final glance at his mother. She didn't look at him, she couldn't. In that moment, Tyler realized he wasn't just being sentenced to life in prison. He was being sentenced to a life without the love or forgiveness of the person who had once meant everything to him. The doors of the courtroom closed behind him, and Tyler knew this was the end. There would be no redemption, no second chances, only the cold, hard walls of a prison cell, where he would have nothing but time to reflect on the terrible choices that had led him there.